Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to give us a follow and turn on your notifications. Now today, I get to share with all of you a conversation that I had with Brian Yeazel. Brian shares his story of making a decision to follow Jesus later in life and then deciding to give to a church. So he shares why he decided to give, how that's impacted his life, and more. This is my conversation with Brian. Hello, Brian. Thanks for coming on to the Ridge podcast.
Hey, John. Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited for our conversation and to hear some more of your story, but maybe you could just start us off and share, hey, when did you start coming to the Ridge?
Well, I'll put it this way. I was not, I did not attend a church for a long time. I mean, my parents had me in a Lutheran church when I was growing up. But when I graduated high school, I kind of dropped out of the church scene, and I didn't really come back to the church until I was in my 50s. So about 8 or 9 years ago, I started attending back initially at a Lutheran church, and then through my girlfriend at the time, my now wife, Carol, she brought me to the Ridge, introduced me to the Ridge, and I quickly made a connection there and was baptized at the Ridge. And that was about 8 years ago. And I have been attending and serving here ever since.
That's awesome. I'm curious if you can, I'm sure you can, if you're willing to, would you mind, what was it that, when you kind of stopped going to church, would you say that you didn't really believe, you didn't really care? What was your attitude towards God, I guess?
I was kind of apathetic. Didn't like the being forced to go every week. Didn't see the point to it. I was busy. I was going to college, and I thought I was just too smart to really need God.
Yeah.
And 3.5 decades later, discovered that relying on myself was not working well for me.
Yeah.
And I needed something. Something was missing in my life, and I found that by when someone suggested I try going back to church.
Yeah, was that something where you had been feeling it for a bit, or was it all of a sudden you're like, wow, I just feel like my life isn't really whole right now, and I want to try to find something?
No, that was my life wasn't whole. I was doing well from a professional standpoint, but my personal life was a mess, and I needed to figure out why, and the only common denominator was me. and so when I spoke with this friend, he said, Brian, when was the last time you talked to God or went to church? And I said, I think it was when I was 18.
Yeah. So
he said, hey, how about trying this? Just give it a try, see what happens.
Yeah.
And it made all the difference for me.
That's amazing. Well, I would love to chat with you. I know it's been historically just a harder thing for people to talk about at all. And that's the idea of giving to the church or giving to a church. I'm curious, before you started to give, how did you feel about the idea of giving to a church? And if you want to, you can include when you weren't really following God and you I'm sure you had different thoughts about people who were giving and all that stuff. So would you mind just sharing?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think most people, if the pastor approaches them and says, hey, Brian, I want to talk to you about giving to the church. You're just going to turn around, and that's the quickest way to end a conversation with the pastor, right? No one's comfortable. Everybody cringes. I think what people forget is that most companies in this country, large or small, most government organizations, wherever you work, many places encourage giving, and even at the IRS, what's one of the few things that you can do that you can deduct from your taxes? It's giving. So the government encourages people to give. Company encourages people to give. I worked for a very large organization, a Fortune 100 company. They had annual campaigns for a couple of specific charities in the area. So it's not just a church thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think, quite honestly, I think most people want to give, that they feel good when they give, whether it's buying Girl Scout cookies. I mean, I think that you're still giving. You're supporting a charitable organization, or you give through your office to United Way or some other organization. And I think that, those types of things, people, I think it is a career path. My giving path was when I was young, first starting out working, felt like I don't have any money.
Yeah.
I don't have enough money to support myself, let alone to give away to others. So whether it was a fear of not being able to afford to have an apartment, or just plain selfishness on my part, little of both, I suspect. But then I went to this, I had a couple of years in the office that I was working, and I had a little more money and a little free money. And I'm like, you know what? And they talked to me about giving to a couple of organizations. And I'm like, okay, I guess I'll do that. And while it felt okay, it was more of an obligation. But we really hope that everybody in our department gives, or, our company keeps tabs on how many people give to an organization. So even if it's just $1, Brian, just to say you participated. Okay. So you start out with that. And then, you meet people along the way, and maybe somebody has a health issue, and they say, boy, you know what, let's support this organization or that organization in memory of someone that you may have known. So, you feel good about that. So there are many, many different worthwhile organizations to give to. But for me, at least, the question of why was I giving was an issue. And it wasn't so much out of thankfulness. It was, well, I like that organization, or I know so-and-so at that organization. So, I'll toss them a little bit to help them out.
So almost like was it like I kind of want to be a good person, so I want to give, like that type of feeling? Exactly.
And then sometimes, you may be approached by somebody, hey, we're going to this fundraiser, and you're going to get tapped for something, and you're sitting at a table with other people that have all been invited, and you don't want to be the guy who's, Scrooge that's not going to open the checkbook. Yeah. So, you say, okay, well, let's see. They're auctioning off tickets to a Packers game, or
I can do that.
And so I'll put the paddle up.
It's for charity, right? Yeah,
exactly. But again, the reason isn't to glorify. It isn't for thankfulness. It's really for me to stand out in the crowd, or for people to look at me. Oh, there's Brian. He's a good guy because he helped support this cause. So coming to church, here's a great story. I started attending this church when I was in my early 50s.
Yeah.
I asked a coworker of mine, hey, how much should I be giving? Flipping a 20 into the collection plates that passed by just didn't seem like there was no rationale behind it. Yeah. And this friend of mine I knew was, been a Christian for most of his life, said, Brian, put in whatever God puts on your heart. I'm like, thanks for nothing. That doesn't tell me anything. Are you kidding me? But God puts on my heart. But his point was this, 2 points. One is that, like anything else, as I think about when I have a question, start with prayer. Ask God. God will tell you. I had no clue. I knew about tithing and, 10% and first fruits and all that, but I hadn't really thought about it in terms of how it applied to me. So praying was good. And the other thing he reminded me is God is not an accountant, when you're sitting in judgment, he's not going to look at you and say, according to my books here, Brian, you gave X. That's going to put you in this neighborhood of heaven. It doesn't work that way, right? So, but as I think back on it, he gave me exactly the right piece of advice. Give what God puts on your heart, and that means commit to prayer. And that helped me really think about not just why I'm giving, but where my giving goes.
Did you ever have any obstacles where, I don't know, you're just coming back to church, you're sitting down, and you hear the church that you're going to essentially ask to give, right? I'm curious what that experience was like before kind of before making a decision to follow Jesus to after.
I'm not sure. I just think that as I've grown closer to God and learned more about what it means to walk with Jesus and follow in his path, it just makes me want to be more and more generous. I don't like the term giving as much as I like the term generous, being a generous person. I think that just it kind of helps define who I am. I am a generous and loving man, and I follow God. And I look for opportunities to be generous now wherever I can, in whatever situation I may be. But I think what we have to think about as we look at what the Bible has to say about giving, and there's a lot of passages. I mean, it might be one of the most popular topics, or most voluminous topics within the Bible. And, I think what happened for me is I was giving a lot to external organizations as I was progressing in my career. Yeah. And when I started going to church, I realized I need to have different priorities as to where my generosity was going. And over time, it shifted much more toward the church, the local church, and less toward these other organizations, which were all great. I mean, I felt good about giving to all of them, but I just realized that God was calling me to do more through the church.
Yeah. And when you say you felt like called, what was that? Was that like something on, like as you were praying, you kind of just like felt this, I don't know. What did that look like for you?
There was an actual moment, and I just recall I had been praying about how much should I give, and I recall this very distinctly. I was in the shower one day, and I, just kind of going through the day's activities. My mind was drifting. I started thinking about, talking to, a prayer, and I felt this number just was very clear in my consciousness. And it was a bigger number than I'd ever considered. And I think of that moment when wrestling with God over this. Here's your number, Brian. Well, I can do this, and I can increase it a little bit. No, Brian, here's your number. And I spent 10 minutes wrestling in my own mind. And finally came down, or I literally got down on my knee and I said, okay, you've given me this number. I will commit to this number. That was the first time where I really felt God put something on my heart. Yeah. As my friend had told me years before.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's an encouragement too to anybody listening. And they're like sometimes it's just a process, like if and that's with anything you ask God about, right? Sometimes we wish that we could get an answer and direction right away. And sometimes it's just, it doesn't work like that well.
And sometimes when you get the answer, you wish,
why did I have to ask?
What you would ask for.
How has it, so you get that number, you say, okay, God, I'm going to go through with this. How did that impact your faith?
That really, really kind of ignited my faith from that point on. And I know exactly what that day was. And from that point on, I really wanted to learn more and dig into the Bible more and be more involved at the church. I think it was shortly after that I started serving on a team, because I wanted to see, okay, what kind of impact is this going to have? And I wanted to be right there to see the difference it was making.
Almost like like your heart began to get more connected with what was happening.
Absolutely. It was definitely a change of heart. And I think that's one of the great things that prayer can do for us, is to change us.
Yeah. And I love the way that there was like a strong purpose behind what was happening, right? Like you clearly, I think that's some great advice that you were given. And I think that it like kind of laid out a way for it to be impactful, right? Because this wasn't from your story, what it sounds like, this was not like a guilt or a shame type of things. This was God, I want to see what you want me to do. And a true like pursuit of that. And I think the intent is so impactful behind why we do the things that God's calling us to do. Has that been your experience?
Absolutely. And from that point on, I've viewed my generosity as coming from that thankful heart, that I know I have a relationship with God, and I'm just so grateful for all He's done to help heal me and heal relationships that I have with family and friends, that I want to do more, be more generous, serve more, be more involved.
Yeah. So you start to see, like you start to see the things that are happening around. How much more did you feel connected to what was going on?
Oh, so much. It really changed my relationship with God from that point on. And I think it helped, oddly enough, as He asked more of me, it helped me build more trust in Him. That, you know what, Brian, I'm going to ask a lot of you, but you're going to see some things here. They're going to blow you away. And that's what I have seen is my outlook on what the church is doing, where I can contribute, where I can make a difference, and where the church can make a difference. It just changed so much and made me a much more joyful person.
That's amazing. I'm curious, what advice would you give to someone who is a follower of Jesus? Maybe they're skeptical about giving.
I think if you're a follower of Jesus already, you're probably giving somewhere, because the concept of generosity isn't just, as I said, it may start out in the home, in the community, through your workplace, with your neighbors and friends. But I think it needs to be developing more trust with God. God is going to use us in ways that can multiply within the community, and not just go, I should trust God with where He's putting the money that I'm already being generous with. So I think reprioritizing, where am I giving and why am I giving to those organizations, and which ones will have an impact that I could perhaps see more clearly. Yeah.
It's almost like you mentioned the word trust a couple times, and I think that's such a powerful word, because I think it does kind of showcase it. It's like, I'm no longer in control of this thing. I'm going to rely upon what God's going to do. And there's kind of a cool freedom in that too. But I do think that like the more you trust something, the more your trust grows in that thing when you see it bear out well.
Absolutely. And I think the control is is another great word here, is that we want to pick and choose where that money goes. And here, God is saying, hey, trust me in this. It doesn't mean you can't give to other organizations. We're not saying that. We're saying, trust me in this. Start with your top priority, giving to the church, and see what happens. There's the concept of the first fruits that's in the Bible. I mean, you don't have to get very far into the Bible, right, to see what God has to say about giving. It's Genesis chapter 4. But there's also the concept of surrender and obedience to God, as well as the thankfulness component, and as the Bible has told us, God wants a joyful giver. Doesn't want somebody who feels obligated or feels like their arm is being twisted. He wants joyful givers. And I think that was my journey, was starting with going from no giving to obligated giving to now being thankful and doing it out of thankfulness. That has been and when I look back over time, it's been a huge shift in how I think about my generosity.
I'm curious. I'm sure there's people right now they give to the church, but it really is out of that feeling of obligation, or there's like an obedience element there too. But I to focus on the obligation piece. If somebody is saying that, like, okay, I want to move to having a more joyful perspective on this side of things, what would you give them any thoughts on that, or advice? Like maybe what was helpful for you?
Oh, that's a good question. And I think, you can go to the Bible verse here again, and some of I'm thinking back to some of the prior messages that Mark has given. And I go back to the 10-10-80 rule. It's easier. God will bless the 90% of what you have to live on. If you give 10, God will bless the other 90%. And I think that's the one area where the Bible says, test me on this, right?
Yeah.
If you're willing to give a little bit more and see what God does with it, and see what God does with your life as well. It's just it just goes back to that building trust with God. And as my giving increased, I felt a better connection with God. I felt more trust in giving. And it just made me, that shift in my heart. I just became more joyful. Every time I gave, I felt better about it and better about it.
Yeah. And I wonder too, how much of it was helped by the fact that it was such a prayerful thing for you, where it was something where you wanted God involved in the process of how you were giving, and it wasn't like a reactionary thing, but very thought out. It wasn't like in the moment, I'm feeling pressured to do this. We never want anyone to feel pressured to give. That is the heartbeat. The heart is beat. We want this to be something that helps your faith. We want it to be something that helps you experience more of the hope of Jesus. And I do think, as kind of cliche as the answer is to pray about it, right? I do think it's like removing the word prayer from it. It's like, hey, have God be a part of that conversation as you're working through that, and involve him in the process. So it's not this reactionary shame thing to God, it's with God.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're partnering with God and coming alongside and seeing what God can do with this. And it will make such a difference. I mean, we've seen over the last few years, now I've been on the finance team here at the Ridge for a while. And what we've seen is tremendous amount of giving going, especially to the Live Big campaign each year. And that's where they love seeing an impact on what they're giving. And that's just one way to partner with God, right? When you see something going well in that aspect, I think that should help everyone say, boy, God can do amazing things with what I'm giving. Yeah. And maybe I should trust him with more of what I'm giving and have not direct so much of my giving to areas that I want, but to areas that God wants. And I think it's just naturally your generosity will shift over time as you build that relationship.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word earlier on about this idea of like, it just like helps you have this attitude of surrender. And I think that it's easy for us to surrender things that are outside of our control anyway. I mean, as easy as it is to surrender anything, right? So, if there's something you have no control on, but it matters, important to you, maybe it's easier to say, God, I'm going to trust you to just take care of this situation. Great. But when you already have what feels like a tremendous amount of control, like over finances being a great example, and you have to relinquish that, that feels like a significantly more like tangible way of surrendering that I think helps grow the other ways that we surrender. And so then all of a sudden it's easier to kind of trust God with, I can't impact how other kids are treating my kid at school, but I can surrender that to God because I've already practiced it in this other area.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For a lot of families, a lot of men in particular, this is one aspect of life that is so hard to give up that control over. My wife and I talk about it constantly. This is the hardest one for Brian. And it's been the hardest one, but it's also been the one where I've gotten the most enjoyment.
Yeah.
Out of giving up that control. Our wife and I are just so much on the same page in terms of where can we have the biggest impact, and we are convinced it's through the church. Yeah,
I mean, I think that brings up a different type of question, right? Like if somebody, what are those conversations around generosity like? Are those things are those easy conversations to have? Like, would you have any thoughts for people that as they kind of wrestle through chatting these things through with their spouse, how to start having those conversations? Maybe what's been helpful for you? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So my wife and I, we do talk about how much we should be giving and where the giving should be going. She has a couple of organizations that she feels passionately about, and I have a couple that I feel very strongly about.
Yeah.
But we have both been almost completely aligned with setting the church and God as our top priority, and making sure that as we look at our annual generosity, that's reflected there. What did somebody say once? You can tell a lot about where a person's priorities are in life just looking at their checkbook. And so when Carol and I sit down and we talk about generosity, we talk about our annual budget, it's always, we're really getting to that point where thinking about how much we give to the church is one of the top is our most important priority at this point.
Yeah.
Not just as what do we have left at the end of the year? It's okay, we're going to start here.
Yeah.
And then work our way through the budget.
Was that something that you had pretty quick alignment on, or was that something that had to like develop? Because I'm sure I imagine being aligned on that probably relieves a lot of the stress around the conversation about it.
It does.
Yeah.
It took a while. Now, my background is, I'm divorced and remarried, and we've been married a little over 6 years. It's only been 6 years.
Yeah, together 8 years.
I'm going back when we first started dating versus when we were married. So,
you're good.
And I think as, initially we had our own thoughts, but now we're very, very well aligned. So it didn't take, it wasn't a decades long experience for us. It was a matter of just a handful of years to where we both agreed. I mean, sometimes I'll, like last year for Live Big, say, Carol, what number has God put in your head?
Yeah.
And she throws out a number and I throw it, and it's unbelievable that it can be the same exact number. Well, okay, that's an easy conversation.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's one thing that I would encourage couples to do is, have conversations about money are often just like really stressful and can often be really challenging. for couples, regardless of even like healthy relationships can have those challenges and struggles and stressors, and the alignment is so impactful. And I think you mentioned the idea of having a budget. I think that makes it a lot, can really help in that regard.
We did when we were either just before or just after we were married. We went through a financial course together, and that helped us a lot with our alignment on thinking about where should our giving go, where should our spending and savings go. So I think, as you said, having a budget, being able to walk through it together, and knowing where you want your money to go each year, that's such an important part of a healthy relationship.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing how kind of God has grown your heart to be generous. And thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
I'm really glad I had the chance to talk about this, John. Thanks for having me.
Well, that was my conversation with Brian, and I love the honesty about his experience and becoming more generous. And loved hearing that his heart really was to hear out what God was telling him and go in that direction. If you would like resources for all things finance related, whether that's budgeting worksheets, explanations on tithing, Bible reading plans to kind of go through some of the stuff that God has said on these things, you can find all that and more in the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.